And we're very happy to have her with us today. She has done, I think, 2 programs for us before. And so for this one, since this was DeSoto's bicentennial year, she said, who would you suggest that I do? And I suggested to her that she do Mary Clarissa Honey Fletcher. Get the full name in here. She was a honey. Her father was a steamboat captain. So she asked for material. We have sent her material. She's been doing a lot of research. And we know how good she is at this kind of program. And so we're very happy to present Diane Moran as Mary Clarissa Honey Fletcher.
I thank you all for coming today. It is terribly hot out, is it not? Ladies, I see that you have forgone your corsets. Indeed, it is much too hot to wear them. However, as long as we are here and not seen outside, everything will be all right, I'm sure. Now, I know you are here because you want to know of my husband. Everyone wants to know a little bit of him. And so I will begin at the beginning. But you see, my husband and I have known each other all of our lives. I cannot say that every second has been wonderful, but I do not have anything to say against our marriage. Our parents were the best of friends. Oh, we lived not far from here. Both my husband and I were born in the town of Herculaneum long ago. 1827 was the year, and our parents, being as close as they were, decided when we were born only a few weeks apart that one day we should marry. Can you imagine? An arranged marriage when we were still yet infants. My dear, how do you think that would be? Suppose your parents had a young man across the street and they promised you in marriage. What if you didn't like him, my dear? My dear, a strange word. I have never heard that. Oh, what is that word again? Weird. It would be strange indeed. But then, my dear, on the other hand, suppose you were the same of mind and the same of heart. Then it would not be strange at all. It would be wondrous to continue on in your life with someone you had grown up with and learned to love as friend and then husband. It wasn't much after we had been married, and we were old enough. We were not your age, certainly not. We were old enough, and when we had been married, we moved. Because here in Jefferson County, we had a county seat. We wanted to live there. Well, my husband could find much work there. And so we moved to Hillsboro. Those years were very, very special. We were newlyweds, but we had a wonderful home. My husband was quickly accepted into the circuit clerk. He did many jobs there, and then he was elected as the official circuit clerk, no longer just an assistant. He studied very, very hard every night. By the light of the lamp, he studied. And at last, he passed his bar exams. He was a lawyer. Sometimes, when I look back on our lives and all that we have done, all we have experienced, I think those simple days, so long ago, those may be my favorite. Our children were still small and with us, our families not far away at all. There is something to be said of families being close, is there not? It seems in these days the children move away and the parents, they rarely see them, for the distance is so far. And the mail, one can never count on the mail, knowing when you will receive a letter, perhaps a month after it has been written. But when they are nearby, a buggy ride away, it keeps the heart warm. Those years, very, very special. Now, my husband had a brother-in-law, Mr. Rankin. They were dealing in business ventures together, and they came upon a magnificent idea. It seemed there was a wondrous piece of land, a large piece of land that, when plotted out one day, would make a fine town. They had plans for a railroad as well. They called this place DeSoto. And in 1856, we left our home and moved to the new town of DeSoto. My husband practiced as a lawyer for a number of years here. He was always highly respected by all of the people who lived here. The people who have lived here have always been of the purest heart, kind in every way. The ladies of the Methodist Church and I have done much. And then, in 1860, the war on the horizon. We heard many things, but we could not believe that there could be a war. Here? No. Somewhere else, perhaps, but not here. Not when folks' hearts were filled with love, or so it seemed. In that year, my husband received a grand honor. He was elected delegate to the Republican National Convention, and he went speaking for Mr. Lincoln. Their ideas about slavery paralleled. And my husband, though his family were slaveholders, he did not hold with the idea of slavery. It goes against our Christian values, does it not? How can it be that one person owns another? No. My husband would do all that he could to further his views of abolishing slavery. When he returned home, much was to be done. And then, 1861, and we received news that Fort Sumter had been fired upon. I remember well. Oh, so terrible, so terrible. How could we know what war could be? How could we? We had never lived war. Our parents, yes, and our grandparents before them, they were all patriots. But now, here on our own soil, no longer fighting against a British king, fighting our own people. My husband had become close with our new elected president. And it would be Lincoln who would appoint my husband as provost marshal. That was 1861, at the beginning of the war, but I tell you, I never suspected that my husband would go to war. My husband, He was needed. He was an official here. But as more news began pouring in and soldiers were needed, my husband organized the volunteer and militia armies here in Missouri. He did much to help. I do not know if you recall of that war. These young ladies, do you know which war I speak of? No. It was long, long before your birth. It was a war in which we fought against our own here in Missouri, as well as other states. And the people here were divided into two different views. Those who called themselves Union or Federalist or Yankees, if you please, dressed in navy blue uniforms. They were against slavery, and they were very angry with the people who were called Confederates, who dressed in a light blue uniform, sometimes gray. These people who were called the Confederates carried an anger as well. They would say to the Unions, "You will not tell us what to do. We go to war against our own government because you have been telling us we can no longer live our lives in the way we choose. You say that we can no longer have slaves. We say to you, how will we then operate our plantations? For you, up north, in all of your factories, with all of the people working, you have no need of slaves, though we know that many of you still keep them. Down here, our economy cannot go on without the help of slaves. You ask us not only to abolish slavery, but to give up our lives as we have known them. You have stripped away all of our states' rights. Our government has become an overpowering ogre. We will not stand for it. We will fight to the last man to uphold what our Constitution and our fathers who made our government have left to us." And so the war began to rage here in Missouri. Some folks said, "Well, you are a Union state. Indeed, even though you are allowed to have slaves, you are considered Union." I don't think they ever consulted all of the people living here. It seems there are just as many, if not more, who are Confederates, who wish to fight for the South, whose loyalties are with the South. I have even been told in the city of St. Louis, there are many fine ladies who do the unmentionable. They are aiding and abetting the enemy. No, they do not put on a uniform. They are as many years old as I. They visit the prisoners, the Confederate prisoners. They write letters for them. They smuggle them out and make sure that those families receive word of their Confederate soldiers. It is against our laws. I have been also told that these women have been abolished from our state. If they cannot be good Missourians, then they should leave. All of their goods are confiscated. Everything in their homes, they are given no money. They are driven all the way down by horse and buggy down to the border states and told to get out. If you wish to aid and abet the enemy, we will make it easier upon you. And now it seems that with people of different viewpoints everywhere, one must be careful of how you speak. For who knows? The person standing next to you may be of the opposing side. We have never made a secret of our feelings. My husband and I are against slavery. Everyone knows this. My husband went to war. I must say, he looked grand in his uniform. But truly, I did think I would see him within a few months. Is that not the way of war? A leave, they call it. But the months went by, and still I heard nothing. And then came the word. He had been wounded at Chickasaw Bayou. He had been wounded and captured by the Confederates. He was in Libby prison in Richmond. There was nothing I could do. He was there half a year, it seemed. And then, in an exchange of prisoners, he was released to come home. Thank God. It was 1862. Our children were so happy to see him, as was I. But he was not long home when he received word that he was needed once again. He would serve in many major battlefields. It seemed he was everywhere except home. 1863 came and went. And still the war raged on. How is it people can continue to kill one another year after year? In our town, the ladies were all wearing black. For this war has touched each and every one of us. We all gather at the courthouse, waiting for the roll call of the dead. I have lost no one. My husband has lost a brother. But still, the fighting goes on, and the same thoughts are within all of our minds and hearts. When will it end? And who will win? What will become of our great nation as we are split? And then, 1864, my husband is marching in a cold rain, which I am sure many soldiers have done before. Perhaps he has been weakened, but the cold centers in his body, and it will not let go. He is so ill he can no longer stand. And in 1864, he is sent home. So long he has been gone from us. It has been 2 years since I have seen him. He is much changed by this war, as are we all. The years of war and death have taken their toll upon each and every one of us. He cannot tell us when he thinks this war will end. But once again, he is called away, and we do not know when we shall ever see him again. And then we receive word that there will be a great battle not far from here. We all shudder to think of it. In a place called Pilot Knob. The president himself has requested that my husband organize militia, for it is feared that the Confederate General Sterling Price will begin a great march throughout Missouri. The South is losing. We all know this. That's what we are told. These are the words in the papers that we read. But for all of those words, how can one say one is winning and the other losing when still both sides have caskets of soldiers marching through the streets in every town every single day? My husband has organized the needed men. He will go with General Ewing. Pilot Knob. I have heard it is a beautiful place, much like our town, except I've been told there are mountains. I do not believe I have ever seen a mountain in Missouri, but this is what I am told. The battle begins, and such a battle. They are greatly outnumbered, my husband and the other men. There are only perhaps 1,000 of them, 1,000 Union soldiers, and perhaps 10,000 of Price and his men. Later, we have been told that many of those Confederate soldiers who came marching up to Pilot Knob from Arkansas were prisoners. They had deserted from the Confederate Army. But when they were given a choice of death for desertion or making one last effort to win the war, well, I'm sure you would choose as they had. And they followed their leaders here, up into Missouri. Many of them had no guns. One can only wonder, how would they fight a war without guns? But the Confederates knew much, and they knew that in St. Louis itself was a large Union arsenal of much ammunition. If Price and his men could capture the arsenal, all of their soldiers would be well equipped. They would go through Missouri, and they would win the war. But my husband and the other Union men stopped them. 1,000 to 10,000. One does not have to be a mathematician to understand the odds, and yet the Union were victorious. Oh, certainly not in the number of Confederates they killed or wounded. They simply outsmarted them. They leapt out of that fort with all of the Confederates in those great mountains I spoke of, and all about the field of battle. And slowly they marched up the road, the Caledonia-Potosi Road. They were seen, but it was so late in the war. Everyone with mixed and matched uniforms. How could one tell who was the enemy and who a fellow soldier? They made their escape, and at an appointed time, a soldier stayed behind, he and a few other men. They were given orders to pile their dead upon the ammunition magazine at Fort Davidson and to blow it up. For if the Rebs were allowed to capture all of that ammunition, it would have furthered their war, which we were so long in praying for an end. When the explosion came, I've been told the folk there living in those mountains thought a great earthquake had occurred. Their houses were shaken to the timbers. And the next morning, when the order was given to fire upon the fort, and no return fire was received, the Confederates realized they had been outwitted by the Union Army. General Thomas Ewing and my husband, Thomas Clement Fletcher. At the end of that battle, the President himself appointed my husband Brigadier General of Volunteer Armies of Missouri. It was a grand honor, President. But once again, my husband would be traveling with the soldiers. No, he did not stay in an office giving orders. He was with his men. And while he was with Sherman on his march to the sea, a telegram was received in their camp. A telegram which told my husband he had been elected governor of this great state of Missouri. I've never been so proud in all of my life, my husband. And then, a short time later, the war ended. We moved to Jefferson City. We stayed in the same home of Sterling Price. He had not been there since 1857 when he left. The house was old, in disrepair. The government allotted $200,000 to make another home for the governor and his family, and my husband declined. No, he said, there is much work to be done, and the monies here shall not be spent on a new home. The one we have will suffice. One would think that as a governor's wife, all would be fine. But I say to you, it was not. There were many parties. I met all of the dignitaries, General Grant himself, and many others. And while these gentlemen were used to their wine and port, it will not be served in my home, whether it is the home of the governor and his family or my home here in DeSoto. There will be no spirits at all. They will have to amuse themselves in other ways. Surely they can find something. They may smoke, but no spirits. I will not raise my children in such an ungodly way. I am a member in good standing of the Ladies' Temperance Society. No. And so we had come to Jefferson City. Oh, I did not like it. Nor did my husband. Oh, indeed, a great honor to be elected a governor. But when my husband took office, yes, the war had ended. Lee had surrendered to Grant. And then, only a few short days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. And in this way, my husband took over the governorship. My husband stated, it is well known, he said, I consider the Confederate soldiers traitors to the United States government. However, we must forgive. How can this great country go on unless we are able to find within our hearts a way of forgiving? Let this great country go on. It will only be greater. But there would be many people in his cabinet who would disagree. And soon, that loyalty oath appeared. There was nothing my husband could do about it. Yes, he was a governor, but he could not turn about that law. Are you aware of what that law did? These are a few of the items. Anyone who sought public office or any type of professional job, such as a minister preaching the gospel, lawyers, judges, teachers who would teach our children, they were expected to sign a loyalty oath which stated that they had never been on the side of the South, that they had never in any way abetted or aided the enemy. Hundreds of our judges, our teachers, our lawyers, our ministers were unable to sign such a document, and they left office. There was confusion everywhere. It was not just in Jefferson City. It touched every single city and burg of this state. Everywhere officials were leaving office, and who was left to take over? Clerks, assistants. So great was the demand for my husband's time. He could not organize quickly enough to have voting for people to replace them, and so he quickly appointed the logical person beneath those who had left. You do know, people were pointing their fingers. Nepotism! Nepotism! He gives these jobs only to his own friends, and he will receive money in return. It is the way of all politicians. I say to you, this was not the idea. Something had to be done. There had to be some leaders. Were not these people the likely ones to take over? They knew the job. And yet always the populace seems to think that there are deep underlying reasons and causes of a negative nature. My husband is an honorable man. I should not say so if he were not. He did much. He did much for the people of this state. He issued an Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all of the slaves. He worked and worked to reestablish foundationed railroads. The railroads had lost much money. He reorganized them, and now there was more building. There would be double the amount of miles that the tracks would stretch because of my husband's work. In the area of education, the University of Missouri received much funding because of my husband. And the Negroes, the Lincoln Institute, it would be able to be funded so that all of these former slaves could be educated and take their place in the workforce. And yet, for all of these fine things that he did, he even brought about a positive economy for the state of Missouri. There were not many people left in Missouri after the war, particularly after the loyalty oath. All of the people who could not sign the oath left. My husband did enforce every single word of that oath, though he wished that it were not so. He was an elected official. The law was plain and simple. He had to do what it said. He was responsible for bringing many new people back to Missouri, telling them of all the grandeur we have here, the many streams, the fine pasture lands. All here where we live, an abundance of animals. And the people came. And they came from Europe, here to Missouri, because of my husband. And now you will point the finger and say, he was responsible for the loyalty oath. We shall never forget what he has done with that. And you would give him no rest. No rest at all. 4 years, much of it in misery for my husband, as governor of this fine state. From 1864 to 1869, when he left office. We moved then to St. Louis. The war was over, truly over. And he was a fine lawyer. We lived happily there. Our children were grown, and my daughter had married. She traveled far and wide with her husband. And then came back to St. Louis. But after all of those long years, 20 years in St. Louis, a fine lawyer's business we had, we moved to Washington. And you know, I do not recall exactly why we did so. I believe my husband had received a more lucrative offer. And so to Washington we went. My daughter, my son, still here. My son was a professor, Christian Brothers College. He was also an official with the railroad, Missouri Pacific. 10 years we spent in Washington. I missed my family. I visited my daughter. And we received a telegram that my husband had died. Willard Hotel in Washington. The year was 18 in 99. I was able to spend a few moments with him before he passed. What does one say at the end of a life? For some people, what is left after a person is here and then is no longer here? We carry the memory of that loved one. And in that way they live on. The physical means of that person. For some, there will be nothing. For others, a small trunk. Others, a small box, a carton. Marriage certificates, birth certificates, a lifetime in a box of papers. My best friend was gone. I went back to St. Louis with my daughter. And now I am happy. I think of him every day. And now and then there will appear something in the papers about what he had done for the good of this state. And once again I am reminded of the grand person he was. Ladies, I believe there is tea being served, and you, sir, you are invited as well, if you don't mind the bantering of the ladies. I'm wondering if any of you have any questions you wish to ask of me. Ma'am.
Yes, Mrs. Fletcher. How soon after the passing of your husband was the little Fletcher Park here and Fletcher Street named in honor of him? I live right on top of the track there, and I just always wanted.
Indeed, ma'am. I have no knowledge of it.
I'll have to see if we can find it in our archives.
And when you do, ma'am, I should be honored to know. Anyone else? I may be able to answer one. You never know. I bid you good day, ladies, and I thank you so much. Good. And now I'm just that person who lives up the road from you. I never realized that DeSoto had such a wonderful past. Truly, I didn't know. And then they sent me all of this neat information. And if that information about the street was in all of that information, I missed it. It's wonderful to think that you know about people who settled an area and what they were like, what their values were. Everything that I have read about her was wonderful. There was even a picture of her. What a beautiful woman. And very gentle. However, everything also stated that she was very strong. You don't get to be the leader or the president of temperance societies and the Methodist missionaries or hold office, daughters of the revolution, without having a bit of backbone. Now, it was her husband that received most of the accolades, but yet things are written about her charming way, her kindliness, things of that type.
Did she just have the 2 children?
As far as I know, yes.
Of course,
And evidently, there were no children, no grandchildren. And so, that meant that when Thomas Clement Fletcher passed away in 1899, it was the end of their family line. Because from all accounts that I've been given, the son didn't marry, or if he did, there were no children. The daughter, nothing. So the family line ended there. What a powerful and strong family for the short time that they were here. And now you live here all these years after, and you have to honor those people, particularly with a street named Fletcher Street. You know, at first, when I was given the information, and I saw her name, Mary Clarissa Honey Fletcher, I thought, how pompous. Come on, what's with that? Well, why isn't her name just Mary Fletcher? Well, wasn't that way. Honey was her family name. So, but evidently people who she was close to just called her Clara. Anyone? Any questions for me? Mm-hmm.
Isn't there a Fletcher house in Hillsborough?
Yes.
Is that connected with
Yes.
the governor? I thought it was.
That's where you
but-
live.
Okay.
That's where you lived.
Yes.
She also lived down there on Main
But,
Street.
but there used to be a house down here, 1 block past Fletcher Street, right?
Yeah,
you live.
didn't they move that and take that down?
It's
Wasn't
gone.
there a home here that was
Still up.
taken down?
They tore it
Yeah.
down.
Husky House.
So
They tore it down.
the place that they lived here is no longer here. There's nothing here, correct? As far,
That's why it's so great that they preserved Fletcher House in Hillsborough.
yes.
Yeah.
You know, growing up in St. Louis, if people talked of Hillsborough or Herculaneum, they were farmers. You know, but no one
Hillbillies.
thought of a governor coming from there. Oh, please, come on. So, interesting. And another wonderful thing was he was the first native-born son to be elected governor. First Missourian elected governor of Missouri, and the first Republican. There's a lot to be said for him, a whole lot. I can't help but think about his father, though, married 3 times, was it, or was it her? Her father, married 3 times, and in those long ago times, now her mother, Clara's mother, was his 3rd wife. But he divorced his 2nd wife. You have to wonder, divorce in those days? I'd like to know about what went on with that. I was also given one little sheet of paper that came from a doctor's notes of his visits in the area. And there were 2 entries, or several entries. One of them, he made a house call to the missus and gave her quinine. There were other entries for the children, and then another one for her. So I got on it, and I'd always been told that quinine was a way to abort a pregnancy. Have you heard that ever? Yeah, okay. So I'm not completely goofy about that. I don't think it works, but people thought that it might. Also, yes. And for muscle aches and joint pains. In fact, it's still used today for muscle aches and joint pains. But I thought I was going to uncover something. I was in Arkansas at the time. I was trying to research it last week, and I stopped in at a drugstore in a little town in Arkansas. And I asked the druggist, can you tell me the historical uses of quinine? He said, no. Well, is it still used today? Oh, not very much. And then he told me about the muscle pains, which is what I got off the internet as well. Boy, I wish I could have turned something up. But still, you do have to wonder about what was her illness at the time. Why was she given quinine? It was a common thing. It wasn't like she was unusual, but it makes you curious to wonder what was going on. Headaches. It's also useful. Anyone else? No?
So he was affluent enough that she didn't have to worry about money while he was gone all this time?
Yes, yes.
Were they landed people or actually came from a wealthy family? Or?
Yes, they had land. In fact, when he was governor, and he chose that they live in the old governor's mansion instead of appropriating all of these thousands of dollars for a new home. He said he had to borrow on his land holdings just to keep his family living in the way they were accustomed to. Because the governor's position paid very little, and he had to dip into his own pocket just to survive in Jefferson City. But by all accounts, they were fine. In the records, there's nothing of them going without food or without clothing. Quite the opposite for people in the South who were landed gentry. And when there were no goods passing down to the South, no French silk gowns anymore for the senators' wives, and no fine food, reduced to eating cucumber sandwiches. They were really complaining about the fact they hadn't had new French gowns in several years since the war began.
Please come have some cookies and punch before you leave.
Oh, you really do have some?
Yes.
I was just making that up. Well, we'll still let that man come, won't we? There's another one. You can come. We don't know what's going to happen to you, because there are a lot of women here. Have you both been good?
As much as you have to, huh?
Everyone, I thank you so much. Great audience, always here. Small town, but good audience.
And she is always a delight to have, isn't she? We just really do thank her. I do want to say this. I should have sent you a copy of the plat that Mr. Rankin and Thomas Fletcher filed in the courthouse for this town. And that original plat shows a Fletcher Street. It shows we have a Rankin Street. It shows a Thomas Street. They use family names for it. And actually at one time, what we call St. Louis Street on that map shows it only as Louis Street. Rankin's name was Louis Rankin and Thomas Fletcher. So they named streets in the town after family. And so I'm sure, Virginia, that's where the Fletcher came from.
I think the Parkville came a little later.
And, you know, he owned, they were selling lots. If you look back at the old newspapers, you will find that they had laid out the whole town, platted it out, and they were selling lots for people to come in and settle. And of course, Fletcher was instrumental in getting the train to come through here. And so when the train came then in the 1880s, they got the 1870s actually, they got the railroad shops built here. And Fletcher brought in a man named Otto Herman, who had a brickyard in the north end of town. Most of the brick houses, the old brick houses in the town were built by Otto Herman from his brickyard. And he built the first shops, Otto Herman did, for Fletcher. And so, you know, Thomas Fletcher was very important to the growth of this town and the fact that we have it so.
I'd like to ask you all a couple of things. You can help me. In the papers, it said that he was very positive about German soldiers helping the Union Army. But then he wrote a document called The Damned Germans in the Army, the Union Army. She knows about it. Okay, I want to know a little bit more about that. And also, if any of you happen to know any ladies who were, I suppose, nurses during World War II, that I could interview. That's coming up, World War II. And I need some first-hand accounts from the women who served bravely along with the men. Okay, maybe some of you will know.
Did anyone else have something else here to share about Thomas or Mary Clarissa? We do have a copy of her, and of course it had nothing to do with all of her life with Thomas. We do have a copy of her, Mary Clarissa's father's steamboat log on one of the trips that he took from St. Louis down to New Orleans. And it's in our files here. We do have a Thomas Fletcher file. If any of you want to read all that Captain Honey had to say, the Honey family was a prominent family too.
Thank you very much.
And the ladies, I do want to thank our friends of the library who have made this program available to us and are offering us tea and cookies or punch and cookies over here. So right over here beyond the checkout counter, why there's a table with some refreshments, and we hope you all take time to partake of that. And again, Diane, we thank you. It was great. It was really great. Thanks a lot.